Hey, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Doing pretty good.
Good. Fix this.
Awesome. Oh, I'm gonna grab my water real quick and we'll
Good call.
get rolling.
I just had a swig.
Okay. All right. Should be good. Okie dokie. How are you today? Doing all right?
Good. Yeah, I think we got a good topic today. I was
Yes.
talking about it with someone earlier today on a consult. So,
Perfect. So we already have 14 people on, so they're 16 now. Cool. So they're jumping on quick. Awesome. So thanks everyone for joining in. Today, Sarah and I are going to discuss prerequisites for a gut protocol or things to consider before diving into the, our SIBO protocols, Candida protocols, kill off, if you will. And we wanted to jump into this because obviously these are super hot and everyone has seemingly had SIBO, or maybe they don't, and we can kind of talk about what we should look for beforehand.
yeah, I think the testing in general, it's easy just to get test happy, whether that's gut, hormones, whatever it is, and definitely want to have, certain things in place to not only save you money, but, also time and maybe potentially a lot of heartbreak too, if you're not ready for it.
Right. And you and I have gone over, quite a few GI maps and I've gone over them a lot with other people and even when we're getting testing done, we are seeing some of these or a lot of these cases that have kind of like what I would consider minor overgrowth, and even those cases don't necessarily require a full on protocol to necessarily kill them off, because sometimes people already have a GI map when they start, or they are want to get one right out of the gate. And I don't think that it's a bad thing. Like if people have the financial means for it and they want to do it, I think that it's fine to do it. But we got to understand that a little bit of overgrowth or moderate overgrowth doesn't necessarily warrant a full-blown protocol.
Yeah, and that was exactly the conversation that I was having, with someone today was, hey, let's give the body the tools to kind of fight this off on its own. Let's support your digestion, let's support your immune system. And this stuff that you see flagged here, it's probably going to take care of itself. And, looking at, someone's symptoms, like, what's actually going on, beyond just the test is, super important, I think, for anyone out there looking at their GI map that maybe feels overwhelmed by the results or, is considering getting some testing done.
Yeah, because some people will be symptomatic with like very little overgrowth, right? Like some people can be really symptomatic with pretty small amount of dysbiosis, but of course they could have other things going on. And some people can be not very symptomatic with, even though they have some,
Yeah.
right? So it's important. Like symptoms are extremely important because there's some things to remember when we're looking at a GI map, especially. So like what I like to tell people is like when we look at blood work, we have female ranges, we have male ranges. We kind of have this idea of like if you train the day before, it may skew these things. Like we know all this context, but we don't really have that as much with a GI map because we have different sizes of people. We have all these factors. And like for example, a male that's eating 4,000 calories is certainly going to have probably more bacteria present than a female that's eating 1,200 calories. So that in of itself would yield like two different results
Yeah.
on, even though both people could potentially be healthy,
Right.
right? So that's pretty important. And someone actually just asked, do people typically have the same bacterial overgrowth or does it vary by case. Um,
I,
Go ahead.
yeah, I would say it varies by case. I mean, what I see actually more of, maybe at least lately, is low beneficial bacteria and not necessarily overgrowth.
Right.
I've gotten a lot in a row with that. You also see a lot of, I see a lot of H. pylori with the GI map, and not necessarily a lot of overgrowth, which the H. pylori, that's, a virus, and the GI map is very sensitive to picking it up. Um, so it's just, if you're symptomatic with it, because most of us have it, kind of present, but not necessarily is it causing issues all the time. Um,
Right.
so yeah, and then as far as like which bacteria are overgrown, yeah, it's going to be different, person to person. Usually see like the same like one or two
Yeah.
guys, and then plus a
Yeah.
couple others,
Yeah.
depending on the
Yeah.
person.
I think I would venture to say that the majority of cases that have some overgrowth in that dysbiotic bacteria, like the Streptococcus bacterias, those strands, the
Bacillus,
those
yeah,
staph strains, bacillus strands, like those are really common. And then from there, it's kind of just a toss up, depending on the person in the case. And you brought up a really good point there too about low commensal bacteria or low beneficial bacteria, because and I believe we talked about this, and I know I've had a lot of cases like this where people are presenting really similar symptoms. It's an inability to kind of digest meals, bloating, even outside of
mm-hmm.
eating, right? And they don't have overgrowth necessarily, or they have very little overgrowth, and a lot of these symptoms are just presented because they just lack bacteria to digest food.
Yeah,
So um, I have a theory. I have a theory about this too, because I think what's happening now more and more is people are going to functional health coaches or doing these things on their own and assuming they have SIBO, and they're getting run through one, two, three, four protocols. And
yeah.
by the time they get to that third or fourth time where they're still presenting symptoms, they actually have just wiped everything out. So they're symptomatic because there's nothing left there,
Yeah.
right?
Or I see a lot, they hop on like a low FODMAP diet by themselves. So, anyone listening, that's going to be like fermentable, like carbohydrates, and fibers, and a lot of healthy foods, right? Like asparagus, apples, like things like that. And people eliminate all these foods that are feeding up those good gut bacteria, right? So it makes sense that, their body, is kind of presenting, low in these, beneficial, guys.
Right. And so I think that's even more important for people that have done low FODMAP for extended periods of time. Like I'm seeing, like I've been on low FODMAP for a year. Like, that's probably not good. Or, they've done, and I'm not really faulting anyone necessarily, but I think that they go to the first coach, they run the SIBO protocol, they probably needed it, and then then they have some kind of like maybe poor transition out of the protocol or something like that. Then they go to the next coach and they're like, hey, I have SIBO, right? Because they did have it before. So they get put right back on the kill off again, right? And then we just keep repeating this like perpetual loop of just killing, 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 killing,
Right.
and everything's wiped out. Or antibiotic use for extended periods of time
Yeah.
can definitely do that in some people.
And that's why like having these prereqs in place is so important, so that we don't like run into those situations where, we're looking at like having to rerun, a protocol. And like, I've definitely been, like guilty of that as a coach, like in the past, like rushing into things, thinking someone was good and they really needed more time establishing some of these habits, or even like a mindset thing. And it usually does backfire, and then you're just both left frustrated. um
Right.
yeah, where was I going to go with that? I think just being able to kind of like adhere to like diversifying your diet, for one, like just back to that example with like the low FODMAP. Like if you're struggling to eat more than like 3 servings of veggies a day, you can't do that, for whatever mental barrier, not a digestive barrier. Like we need to kind of establish that first.
Right. So let's talk about what some of these prerequisites are. Let's talk about why they're important and why you will probably not be successful in the long run if you don't implement them, because that's really the most important takeaway is that a protocol, and we're using this term protocol, and a lot of what we're talking about is like these kill off protocols, right? These more intensive, like kill protocols.
Stages, yeah.
Yeah. So the reason that people generally don't have a lot of success, and actually, this is pretty common in the medical world where they use antibiotics, rifaximin, neomycin, these antibiotics, is recurrence rate is really high. And that's because generally there's not an exit plan, right? So, or I would say both, there's not an exit plan, but there's also no lifestyle prerequisites in place. So we always have to think about, okay, well, how did we get here, right? Like what caused us to have this SIBO or this candida or any of this dysbiotic overgrowth in the first place? And that's really where our prerequisites start, because I would venture to say that the majority of the cases are not from overeating. It's not like we're getting a whole bunch of, general population that have SIBO because they eat McDonald's 3 times a day,
Mm-hmm.
right? If we did, that would be great, because that would be probably pretty easy to fix,
Yeah.
right? But outside of, and I probably deal with this a little bit more than you, but like I do deal with a fair amount of male functional cases that do kind of stem from high food, like that makes it worse. But I would say the vast majority of them in the female population are undereating, right? They're undereating, overstress. So like we don't have a food intake issue that's causing dysbiotic overgrowth. We have a lifestyle issue. We have a stress issue.
Right. And that's where I usually start as far as like prerequisites, or like kind of looking at what is your root cause or contributing root cause, is like how you're eating and how you're going about like just approaching your nutrition as a whole. Because a lot of the issues that I see with my clients stem from chronic like dieting and chronic like restricting and all these like hacks, to kind of beat the hunger that inevitably lead to digestion issues. So things like, fasting all day and like, cramming your food late at night, or like excessive volume eating, that's a big one. And then, coupling that with the excessive cardio and the overtraining, things like that, that leave you kind of more vulnerable for, and leaky gut, is the colloquial term, right? That most people
Right.
know. But these habits that women just have, and again, like sometimes it's just it's not even a fault of their own. It is what it is, but it leads to some issues GI wise or thyroid. Things slow down, including digestion and food, and it just sits in your gut. So kind of looking at how did you get here? What's your kind of timeline? Is kind of important to see like where you can focus in on first, from a habit standpoint.
Yeah, you brought up some great points. The diet culture, people trying to get really lean, people that have prepped either recently or in the past, they generally carry those, like a lot of those habits stick with them for long periods of time. So you brought up some really common culprits like the volume eaters, trying to take your macros and cram as much volume into the macros as you can via usually low calorically dense foods, vegetables, like things that are pretty high FODMAP, right? The very high fiber. So those are really disruptive to digestion. Also, creating elaborate, like, cakes and puddings and like doing all these
Yeah.
things on a regular basis. And all of those things, especially some of the fillers, xanthins, like stuff like that, definitely causing irritation. A lot of these like voluminous foods also are going to pull a lot of water into the GI tract. So a lot of these, that in and of itself is probably going to impede your acid environment
Mm-hmm.
to break down the meals. So there's a number of things there that, from like the dieting culture standpoint, these habits that people pick up that kind of take with them. And the fact of the matter is, they don't they don't, a lot of them don't really ever get out of the low calorie environment, right? Like they're coming to us and they're still in the low calorie environment. So we have to A, break that, and B, kind of redo the whole structure in terms of food selection and diversity. Because what we know about, and I do this with all my clients, is like, even if we're doing like a more meal template based plan versus a macro plan, there still needs to be a little bit of built-in variety within the plan. It doesn't have to be 25 foods, but I mean, you got to have at least a few different options and start rotating through things on a regular, semi-regular basis in order to create this microbial diversity
Right.
within the
Right.
gut, right? So that's super important.
Yeah, and this stage can be really hard for people coming from that background because a lot of times like we do need to get your calories up, but we need to do it in a way that isn't going to overwhelm your system. So I might tell you to have coconut oil, and olive oil and fruit juice and things that might, you know, provoke a lot of anxiety because, they're more calorically dense, less volume. And, I get it. Like I've been there, so it does, it'll take a lot of like kind of time and kind of work on like, hey, like trust that your body knows what to do with this food. And it's, I mean, mentally like something that, a lot of people have to kind of unpack, like, the kind of thoughts that, lead them to believe that they have to stay lean, or, a fear of hunger a lot of people have, as
Yeah,
we kind of make these food increases.
yeah. Yeah, I really like that, and I like that you pointed out the difficulty in that process because it is difficult, but I also think that there's a mistake, and this is kind of a prerequisite to all of our most functional cases, that because almost all these cases have a hormone component too, right? Like they generally have something going on hormonally. And the idea now is that we want people to eat as much food as they possibly can to restore this metabolic function and this hormone function, which is kind of a double-edged sword in the sense that you can't just feed people up to massive levels when they can't digest anything. So
Right.
you talked about being strategic with this, and that's where food selection comes into play. So sometimes, and I've gotten this, Coach, these are kind of some weird, like these are kind of like some unconventional stuff you're putting in my plan. I don't. Why is that? And a lot of that is coming from that food volume standpoint and the ease of digestibility, right? So we don't want it to be like you're eating, you know, carb powder and whey isolate all day because that's void of really any micronutrients. But we do definitely have to utilize things that are maybe powders or juices or oils and versus animal fats, like things like that are going to enhance motility, move through the gut quicker, so we're able to not only increase food intake and increase diversity, but also not, make digestion worse in the process.
Right. Yeah, and then back to like, if and then like having that in place so that you're able to maintain that, post transition, post protocol of any type, is key, because if you just go right back to the volume eating, or overdoing the caffeine or whatever, it's just all going to come back.
Yeah, so that's where we kind of can talk about more of the habitual and environmental prerequisites, um, which there's a lot of them. There's a lot of things that come into play there. But ultimately, if we're looking outside of food selection and outside of volume and like all that stuff that we just talked about, it's really a stress equation, right? So we're having to figure out like where can we pull stress, and what habits can we improve on. So it can be a number of things, right? It can be the overtraining tendencies, overactivity tendencies, cardio, right? It can be environmental stress tendencies, but ultimately we have to get it down enough to where we are able to, if we do implement some kind of protocol, that A, we know that it's going to work,
Hmm.
and B, we know that these habits are solid enough to maintain. Because a lot of the time the client comes in, they know they have an issue, or we at least let them know there's an issue and they want to fix it, but they kind of just want to fix it so they can go back to doing what they were doing, which is a
Mhm.
really a faulty mindset that's probably not going to yield any long-term results. So, but the reality of the situation is like, if you do want to be able to diet again and get lean again and prep again and do any of these things, like we've got to have a really solid foundation in play, and enough time in front of us to be able to do that and maintain it.
Yeah. So like those meal hygiene habits, like as dumb as they might sound, like the chewing your food, not eating when stressed, it's those little things that are going to make, the biggest impact. And like you said, like looking at stress, like it doesn't always have to be like emotional stress. Like it can be like, what are like little ways that maybe you're, stressing your body out while you're eating. So like one example I give for myself is I used to watch like YouTube videos when I was eating, and I would watch a lot of like training videos and like
Like
videos of, yeah, like hype
hype stuff.
videos. And like I was almost, through a gut protocol, and I like I was still having this bloating that would like pop up, and I'm like, you know what if I like just don't watch YouTube or listen to like some chill music? And sure enough, like the bloating that I was experiencing went down. So like all the people like listen to music or just like watch like what their environment is like, when they're eating. Coming home from the gym, like roll down the windows, like play some like more chill music, as you drive home, and kind of really get in that parasympathetic, that rest and digest state, before you get home and make that post workout meal. So those are like little things. Like it doesn't always have to be like break up with your boyfriend, like sometimes it might be, but when we look at like stressors, like there's a lot of things that go into the bucket.
Yeah, for sure. These, because as bodybuilders or athletes or whatever term, people in this lifestyle, whatever term you want to kind of use, there's, and I said this recently. I don't remember, it was a podcast or something, but I'm like, I don't know what makes people think that they're special in the sense that they can have all of these other stressors, bills, family, work, like all this stuff that every other person deals with, and beat the hell out of themselves at the same time and still get away with it. Because just because you eat a little bit better diet, it doesn't really make you immune to all this,
Right.
right? So we have to understand, and I've used this kind of imagery for a long time, like this pie chart, of looking at the slices on the pie. Like if you're allocating a lot of this pie to environmental stress, you only have so much of it left to allocate towards training or towards cardio or towards whatever. So you have to be cognizant of that, and it can, and sometimes, and this is kind of what I talked about on the live that I did yesterday. Sometimes you really have to start at the bottom with this and just start by like building awareness of stressors. So sometimes for people, it's really just a matter of like taking inventory. That's what I call it. It's like take inventory of what is causing these stressors. What is causing this sympathetic response. And the best thing that we can do is just be honest with ourselves and maybe write it down and maybe hold ourselves accountable, because a lot of time that we don't, right? We are on autopilot. We're busy. We're going through our routines. And I think it's really helpful if we can start. This is where, for some people, like journaling might be helpful for some people. Some people, it might be just grabbing a sticky note and just write
Break
everything
up.
down on
Yeah.
there.
Don't,
Pros and cons list,
yeah.
you know what I mean? But there has to be some way that we can get an initial breakdown of what's going into that stress bucket. Now, as coaches, if you do it enough, you get pretty good at it. You can read the consult, you can get a feel for the client, you can do that, and you generally know. We said this yesterday. If you do it enough, in the first 5 minutes,
Yeah.
right? You're like, okay, it's this, and this, and then you learn some little details along the way. Like you pick up on some habits of the client and stuff. But majority of the time, you can tell pretty quick what it is, and then this is where it's kind of daunting to people, because like, all right, we've got all this stuff, we got all this stuff that we need to work on. So I like to do it in the path of least resistance. Like start with the things that are probably easiest first.
Mm-hmm.
Like what things can we change pretty easily right off the bat? Stuff that you talked about that you just mentioned are great. Habitual stuff built into your routine, being calm when you eat, understanding your environment, you know, long enough time periods after you train to eat, like all of these things, sleep and wake patterns, all this stuff's relatively easy to control for the most part before we start diving into things like trauma and, you know, like really heavy topics that are a little more difficult.
Yeah. And a lot of times when you start working on those smaller things, it gets easier to deal with the bigger things, right? Like if
Yep.
we work on, our sleep a little bit more, like we just kind of gain some clarity, with just, the rest of, our day. And like you said too, like let's be realistic. Like if you're a new mom and you got two kids under two, maybe sleep is what it is, right? And we kind of picked another area to kind of dial in on because you've made a post on this, like you don't want to stress about your stress.
Right.
We want to be aware of it, but we want to be kind of realistic here, and just know that it's gonna be there, and our perception of it really is everything. I mean, that's gonna have the greatest magnitude on your health is how you're perceiving these stressors.
100%. And I've said this. I'm human just like everyone else. Like I still get stressed, but I would tell you that I can firmly say that compared to, 3 years ago or 5 years ago, um, analyzing it and discarding it, I'm much better at that process, right? Because the reality is you're not really removing yourself from a certain environment, like you said, unless you're getting out of like a toxic relationship or you're changing careers or something like that. Majority of the time, your day is kind of what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Like you have the same stuff every day, but there's a certain way that you can potentially approach it. And the first step in that process is just being aware of what it is. Like being aware of what it is so you can recognize it and you can understand, like, is this worth my mental energy? Is it not worth my mental energy? And sometimes that takes a lot of reinforcement. Like, I mean, I'm sure you've done it. Like, I have to remind people of the same two things for, the first 6 weeks before we can kind of really get into a
Yeah.
habit.
Do the next thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean,
Yes.
that's what we need. Like, that's why we have the weekly check-in. Like, I mean, I would say like if you are someone that's dealing with this stuff, like the weekly check-in, like, is really, really valuable. Like having that weekly accountability versus like a one-off consult, like, be honest with yourself about, kind of how, accountable you're going to be. And, at least for the first, kind of 6 weeks, like you said, like, just having that reinforcement. Yeah. And make it, idiot proof, like make yourself sticky notes, like leave yourself reminders. I'll have people like set silent alarms on their phone to like breathe, or if you're struggling with meal timing, set alarms to go eat, if that's what you're struggling with.
Yeah. And in my goal with people is always that we start with that initially, but I really want the process to become automatic after a while. Like I don't want them to have to hyper focus on all these things
Right.
all the time forever. So
Yeah.
I said this to a client the other day. Like they kind of came in and I noticed that their check-ins were getting shorter, right? Well, it's because all the stuff that they were having to like they had their typical feedback and their tracking and like all this stuff, but all the other stuff was just them kind of venting out things that they
Yeah.
were working on
Life
and
stuff.
they were stressed about. But now that stuff's kind of dwindling down in updates, and it's not because they're not working on it. It's just because those reminders that they were setting and those practices are now habits. They've shifted them and they're automatic. So ultimately, that goes back to like, don't stress about your stress. Is once you build that recognition and you get the skill set, you really want it to be kind of an automatic process, right? Before you're, at least for the most part, and then you're ready for whatever protocol might ensue after that. But like we've seen, there may be no protocol, right? There could
Right.
be there could be plenty of situations where 90% of the symptoms are going to subside.
Yeah, and people love timelines, but I would say give it at least, 2 months, at least a solid month of like honestly like checking these boxes. kind of before you decide on like, a next step. Because I mean, when we think about too, like the gut microbiome, like it's not just, you eat good for, 3 weeks, or, make some positive changes to like your meal hygiene, and boom, everything's better. Like some things might be better, but it's going to kind of take time for, that gut to kind of repopulate, and, or, kind of things to heal.
Yeah, for sure. So I figured we would also talk about baseline, some baseline supplemental support during the process, because it's not like you can't add some additional support, because there's definitely things that we can do that will start helping, and so we can minimize the chance of needing that protocol later. And kind of what things are we looking at? Well, um, generally it's kind of 2 to 3 main things. So inflammation, that's kind of that's probably the catch term there, is getting inflammation down. Also really repairing the gut lining. So our guts basically have like a mucosal lining, and our GI tract is a mucosal lining that lines it. This is what protects us from more systemic issues. So that permeability issues, we really need to build up this barrier, right? So we're not susceptible to a lot of these systemic issues. So systemic issues would be things like the inflammation becoming systemic. So joint pain and autoimmune-esque stuff, psoriasis, eczema, brain fog, all these issues. Not now, they're not in the gut anymore. They are systemic throughout the body. So we really want to kind of fortify this gut and kind of get everything right, blocked inside, right?
Yeah.
So we can start kind of doing our thing. Um, so what stuff do you like to use on the front end? So maybe when we're going through the foundational phase,
Right.
what things might we implement?
So kind of with the intestinal permeability in line, and that, mucosal layer, I would say zinc carnosine is going to be like a big one, for me, that I like to implement for people. And then with that, I'll do glutamine sometimes, but also if someone has an autoimmune condition present, then I usually do colostrum instead of glutamine. It's more expensive, so it's kind of case by case. But I like that combo, a lot, as far as, just intestinal lining kind of support.
Right, because what we're trying to accomplish there with the zinc carnosine is sealing up that lining, and then the colostrum provides us with immunoglobulins, so we're supporting the immune system. So when you mentioned autoimmune condition, like really what we're experiencing there is the immune system has kind of like faulty cells. These autoimmune cells are attacking tissues. So for us, commonly that's like thyroid. That's probably the most common one, Hashimoto's, or it could be any of those. Like even a lot of those skin issues are generally considered autoimmune, right? So we're trying to cool off all of these processes and bring that immune function down or regulate it to a normal level, which is what those immunoglobulins will help with, and the zinc carnosine sealing up that gut lining. And then if we use glutamine, glutamine actually has like a lot of good literature. It's a supplement that has some good research behind it. Shows us that it will help with microbial diversity and that mucosal lining of the gut. So like sealing all that stuff up. And then there can be like some other select cases that present some different symptoms. So sometimes we could maybe have someone that has like acid reflux or GERD or something on the front end. That's maybe potentially something we can work on before we decide to implement a more intensive protocol. So doing something as simple as a baking soda test, maybe, to kind of take a look at that. Or if they already have pretty pronounced reflux, it's going to be a little more obvious, of course. So implementing betaine, if we're having a PPI that's in the mix, I would really like to probably see that out before we're implementing any kind of SIBO protocol or anything like that. Someone asks, how much glutamine do you recommend and fasted? Yeah, so I like to take, for glutamine without food, is what I would prefer. Dosages can be, I've done anything from like 10 grams up to like 60 plus grams.
Yeah, usually
So
for females, I'm looking at least 20 grams a day,
yeah,
kind of split into. And yeah, like fasted. Sometimes, um, too, like if you're struggling, like to back to what we were saying about eating enough, food and making things a little bit more, calorically dense, like, it's an amino acid, right? It's obviously like not a complete protein, but you can kind of use it like at a little higher dose if someone, maybe you have to lower your protein, a little bit just for some, kind of amino acids.
yeah. So it still has caloric value, right?
Right.
Ultimately, but
I don't have people track it, but
yeah, I don't
for
either.
me,
I don't either, but I do. I will. I get. I'm following what you're saying for sure.
yeah.
So I normally determine it more so for one, like how big is the person, females
Yeah.
versus a male, and how much inflammation am I perceiving in the case. So like I would use a higher dose in someone that's presenting a lot more systemic issues because we know that probably the more systemic the issue is, meaning you're having symptoms outside of the gut, right? Then the more chance that you probably have a lot of permeability going on. So that's where I might bump that dose up. So a lot of time I'll use a titration on that. So I'll kind of maybe start at 10 grams twice a day and maybe go 15, 20 twice a day and kind of ramp up because some people maybe notice a little bit of stomach upset if I just tell them to guzzle down 30 grams in the morning.
Yeah, and I like to tell people to take it like right before breakfast as opposed to
Yep.
like have it and then like wait a couple hours, like because usually you'll see like nausea kind of with taking it too soon, or like yeah, just some digestive upset. For the GERD too, I really like DGL chews. That's gonna be like licorice, and that's pretty cheap. It's just again like back to like a soothing kind of ingredient. I also like digestive bitters, which are disgusting, but I
Yep.
really like them. I had one client told me there was this one brand. She's like, "Oh, it wasn't that bad." So like I started giving it to more people, and they're like, "This is the worst thing I've ever had." So you can't win. I had one that I swear to God like tastes like straight whiskey. But
Yes.
anyway, it's just a good kind of way to kind of prime your body to kind of break down your food, especially like protein. I'll often use it too if I'm like not sure about H pylori
Yep.
being present. I like to use the digestive bitters. You could also just use foods like um, lemon, arugula, foods like that are bitter to kind of help just stimulate that digestive process. Apple cider vinegar, people shit on it. I'm not talking about an apple cider vinegar gummy, but I do use apple cider vinegar with people, like the
Yeah.
actual thing. Dilute
Right.
it in water. I need to say that just to protect myself and your esophagus, but
Yeah. Yeah. It's you mentioned H. pylori there. That is something that, with it being relatively common, is something that we kind of want to knock down on the front end before we start going into the protocols. So yeah, mastic gum, DGL, especially, and like I said, I work with a lot of men too in these cases, and they are even a higher occurrence of H. pylori because their their acid requirements are generally so much higher because they eat more food, right? So more food, more protein, especially a lot of these bodybuilders that I'm getting with that are coming in eating like 350 grams of protein. Like we're going to have some over time, a lot of them are going to end up with a lot of inflammation. So a lot of like IBD issues, Crohn's, colitis, stuff like that. And H. pylori, acid issues. So I might add in the mastic gum and DGL as part of the like soothing H. pylori portion on the front end of that as a prerequisite, I guess, if you would call it that.
yeah, no, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, there's a lot of like little things like that, little food choices, like tea, like if you're a tea fan, even if you're not, like some of this stuff, it's like kind of suck it up, buttercup, like I'm not telling you the glutamine's going to taste great, like it's kind of like stuff you do because it's, good for you.
Yeah, so what I do in the mornings is I'm actually right now doing I just posted a little update today. I'm doing kind of a cleanup phase and my gut was getting kind of stressed out because my food just gets high, right? So during my cleanup phase is also a chance for me to kind of clean up my gut at the same time. So the first portion of that is kind of these prerequisites. Glutamine comes in, zinc carnosine comes in. Um, I've had a tendency to have a little bit of H. pylori in the past, so the mastic gum and DGL come into play. Um, I really just do my glutamine. Zinc carn's a pill, so that's easy. But I normally just do my glutamine in the morning. I'll pour some apple cider vinegar into it, and if I have like any type of flavored supplement in the morning, like I have like a kidney support and inflammation slash joint support supplement, I just mix it into that
There you go.
because it does knock it down a little bit as far as the it not tasting so bad.
Yeah.
Um,
Aloe juice
it
was one we didn't really mention, but are you still using that with people?
Yeah, so I'll use especially like the really high inflammation cases, like the soothers are going to be really really important here to knock this down. So like I posted a guy this morning, and I was like, he's 1 week in, he's dropped 8 pounds, et cetera, et cetera. And it was basically just inflammation, right? So a lot of that was we thought he had some digestive issues, thought he may need a little more intensive protocol, but I'm going to come in at the beginning and knock as much of that down. So the analogy, like the kind of the picture that I painted was like your car needs repairs, but your car's on fire. Like you got to put the fire out before you can make the repairs to your vehicle.
Yeah,
You
totally.
know, so that's where setting up that environment is going to be super important. But yeah, I mean that's really all that I think most people need from a supplementary standpoint at the beginning, because as we talked about, the environment is going to be the end all be all for the majority of people. And I think it's also important to point out that like I have plenty of people that don't take any digestive supplements,
Yeah.
like just don't need them because we're really well designed. Like our body's really well designed to maintain and adapt to fluctuations. And when we talk about microbiome, like some people will say, hey, I read a study that if you take this or you do this or whatever, it changes your microbiome. Well, the important thing to remember there is every single thing that we do all day long, there's always micro adjustments. So if you drink water, there's going to be a micro adjustment in your flora. If you eat a meal, if you trained, right? If you
Travel.
took,
Yeah.
right, like anything is going to have some adjustment in flora. So that's why we can't really get too caught up in this idea of like, here's a test and it
Yeah.
has to stay this,
Yeah.
right? Because there's always going to be adjustments.
Right. Yeah. I think and two, that just leads to like the neuroticism, right? Like and all that we're trying to avoid, in the first place.
Right. And so that's where symptoms really are going to, reign supreme. So another thing talking about symptoms is in this kind of like early phases is like what do these different symptoms mean? I wanted to kind of touch on that at the end of this and kind of like what do these symptoms mean and what may they indicate? Because there are some telltales. Because commonly, I think now they're reading a lot, they're researching, and with SIBO and these types of protocols being super hot, I think it's maybe important to kind of decipher the difference between what a really pronounced SIBO case would look like and maybe what it wouldn't look like,
Yeah.
right?
So
So, go ahead.
SIBO is like a very distinct like SIBO belly. Like there's gonna be that like pregnant belly kind of look. And even fasted, like first thing in the morning, like it'll pop up or just after like drinking water. There'll be like it's usually I usually see one or the other as far as like constipation or diarrhea or like bouts of
Right.
diarrhea followed by the constipation. Um, gas, would be a like really stinky like sulfur gas, would also be a big symptom. But just being distended after a meal, like a little bit of bloat, isn't necessarily like SIBO, right?
Right.
Like you might have nothing wrong with your gut and be a little distended after a meal. Like that's
Right.
normal, right? You're full.
Right.
Um, you know, and that there's a difference between like painful distension and like bloating, right? And a lot of times SIBO, the bloating is painful. Um, Like,
Yeah, it feels like what I always tell people is, they'll say, "Hey, I'm bloated." I'm like, "Okay, are you bloated after you've eaten 5 meals?" I'm like, "Okay, well, you've eaten all day,
yeah,
right? You're full. Like, what do you feel like in the morning or early in the day?" So you mentioned this painful bloating. SIBO, a lot of time, what it will feel like is almost, even if there's nothing in there, it's almost like a hard pressure, like an air pump
yeah,
is being pushed in there. Because what happens is these bacteria, so a literal SIBO breath test is just testing for gases, right? Like you blowing into this thing, it tests for gas. So these bacteria will overproduce these hydrogen or methane gases or both. And that's where a lot of this like really pronounced pushing feeling comes. And that's why it's pretty evident. And what we'll see visually is when we look at that side profile of the person, it's that belly button down bloating. Like we'll sometimes see that the stomach's obviously located up higher, right? So the stomach doesn't house a lot of bacteria. It's a very acidic environment. There's not a lot of bacteria going on there. Most of it is in the intestinal tract. So like we could see the stomach flat in some people, even like some people literally like the rib cage area and right below is not distended. And then we get to the belly button and all of a sudden there's a huge distension.
yeah.
That's pretty that's pretty evident that there's gut or that there's intestinal dysbiosis going on in those cases just based on where it's located and how they feel, right?
Yeah.
So understanding visually what the symptoms look like, what they feel like, understanding that yes, if you're in a muscle building, surplus phase and you're getting full as the day goes on, yeah, no shit, right? Because you're eating all day long. So those things are normal. And we can do things like I could even do like challenge tests where you know, let's see what happens when we do like a 24-hour fast. Like let's see what happens when what does your gut look like? Are you literally still waking up bloated the day after you do a 24-hour fast? We haven't eaten anything,
Yeah.
right? It's pretty dead giveaway that there's bacteria that are producing pressure and producing gas and that's pushing that stomach out, right? So go ahead.
No, I mean, you pretty much nailed it. Like, if you can't suck it in, like, if it's like, it's very, like, I think it's very, like, if you have it, like, kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, and with a lot of those low bacteria cases that you mentioned at the beginning, they kind of do present that to a point, but I noticed that with the low bacteria cases, they are a little bit more of they get bloated as the day goes on because they don't have the ability to actually digest the meals. So they may present similarly, but they are a little bit more aggravated by food and a little bit more bloated by food. Whereas SIBO, it can be totally random. Like you can have bloating at any point, anytime. I've
Yeah.
had people that are like, "Hey, I woke up out of my sleep because I was like so uncomfortable," you know, like that kind of pressure.
Yeah, and a lot of
So
times like a stress back to that will like bring it up. Like I remember for me, like I'd be like just driving and then I'd be like, oh, I'm kind of like, I would notice like just that like all of a sudden my seatbelt would feel tight and I'd get that like distension going. And I'm like, oh, I'm like gripping the wheel and like stressed out, even though I didn't eat anything. So yeah,
yeah,
and it's not comfortable. Like it's very, uncomfortable to deal with.
absolutely. And then other symptoms that may present that would be that these could be coupled with SIBO, but they may not be indicative of it, or those kind of systemic symptoms we were talking about. So this is where that term, I know leaky gut's not a medical term, so anyone wants to get mad, that's fine. But we'll call it hyperpermeability, where basically what that is for people that don't know is these junctures in the gut are kind of like, or junctures in the GI tract are kind of like stuck open, right? They're allowing stuff through
Yeah.
that really, right, that shouldn't be going through. So um, this is where this is where we see people with a lot of the, a lot of the skin issues presenting, a lot of the systemic inflammation, joint, brain fog, things like that. Some people will get especially if their immune system's really stimulated, they get those histamine type symptoms going on where they'll even get kind of rashes
Hmm.
or redness in the skin. I've even, even people getting like full blown hives,
Yeah.
right? When they're stressed out, seeing that really pronounced histamine response. Now, again, that's not to say that those people don't also have, SIBO or yeast or something, but those aren't really from that, right? These are more systemic permeability immune system symptoms.
Yeah, and pretty much if you do have the SIBO or you do have some type of yeast overgrowth, like you have leaky gut too. Like it kind of goes with the territory.
Right. And I don't know about you, but I pretty much just assume that anyone with any little bit of a GI issue probably has some permeability issue. And that's why, right. And that's why, like like you and I are talking about, that's why we kind of are sealing up the gut as a prerequisite anyhow, no matter what. Like I do that with every person. I don't think there's any harm in just going ahead and making sure that lining is intact and that mucosal layer is intact every time.
Yeah. Because I mean, again, they're cheap. Like it's, again, maybe something you only do for like 3 months, depending on, what degree we're talking about here. But yeah, like a bag of glutamine goes a long way.
Right. And and antimicrobials usually don't end up being cheap
No.
after a while.
Yeah. Yeah, no. Like the upfront cost is like, oh, okay. And then you have to reorder it. It's like, how long is this going on?
Right. So I'm all for it. Like I'm honest with people up front that hey, yeah, you may need this, but hey, if we can prevent it and not need to spend the money or go through it, then awesome. But yeah, I think that pretty much covers everything that I wanted to touch on. Was there anything else that you had?
I would say just because we mentioned H. pylori a lot, maybe some symptoms with
Sure.
that. That would be like what I usually see is like more of like that reflux, those like kind of GERD kind of symptoms, like a histamine intolerance. Those are like I would say some of the two biggies that I see with people, like a gnawing maybe feeling like in your stomach, even if you haven't eaten anything. Um, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yep. A lot of people with H. pylori do present GERD or reflux. Like they may not always like be burping up acid, but they'll have, burning or reflux-esque type of symptoms
Hmm. Yeah.
for sure. And we did have one question here we can answer. Let's see. After the protocol, would you ease people off? If if you mean like a SIBO protocol, yeah, there's an exit plan. I mean, the exit plan is that you would repopulate with some type of probiotic and adding fermentable, maybe some fermentable foods back in and stuff like that. You would want to consult with someone. Make sure
Yeah.
you do that right. That is super
I
important.
was just gonna say, like, I hate to leave her hanging, but like that would be a really good another live for you to do would be like after the protocol. Because like we were saying at the very beginning, if you rewatch this, like that's where people really get into issues is when they stay restricted or they stay on these supplements for too long, like the killers, and whatnot. Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, like same thing with like the glutamine and whatnot. Like, like that's all gonna depend on like you and the severity. Um, so yeah, I hate to be annoying with those answers.
Yeah, you're right. But that period of time is important. There should be some type of exit strategy. I mean, ultimately, the biggest piece of that extra strategy, besides food and supplementation, is like you have to maintain the habits. You can't if you were restricting alcohol during the SIBO protocol, for example, and then you go back to drinking 6 drinks every weekend. I mean, or multiple times a week, you're probably going to get it back.
Yeah.
So just keep that stuff in mind. You can't. There has to be some permanent changes. I mean, I'm all for especially Gen Pop. Like I'm all for helping people try to live as most normal life as they can, but of course, some of the stuff has to be implemented long term.
That's a good question on why do a GI map. So she said if you can pretty much if it's pretty clear that someone has certain symptoms and you can guess they have a gut issue, why spend 500 on a GI map when you can just skip that and go into a protocol? That's where I would say, again, just from experience, symptoms overlap, right? Like back to what we were saying about like the low beneficial bacteria presenting with a lot of bloating, a lot of similar things that you would see like with like the dysbiosis. Honestly, my favorite part of the GI map is that bottom section about the just like digestive capacity and like immune system. And it's, I feel like, a really helpful tool, but it's not something you always need. Like if you really think someone has SIBO, like, I mean, a GI map isn't going to diagnose them, and as coaches we're not diagnosing anybody anyway. Like maybe you do have them go to their doctor, their GI, and do a breath test, if you're wanting to kind of do some more testing and see if it's covered by insurance. But it's not necessary. Like there's a lot I think you can do without, like we were saying, diving into antimicrobials. But if you're left guessing and you're not sure, like I do think it's responsible to do testing or refer someone out.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, have I done SIBO protocols and stuff without it? For sure. But it's that case where we have a lot of overlapping symptoms, and they've maybe tried these things before in the past, and they've gone through multiple protocols, or they've been kind of like the person that's come in that's like, I've tried everything for my gut. I've taken this supplement and this probiotic and done all this stuff. I'm like, all right, well.
And you have that conversation with them, right? Like, hey, we're going to do this. Like,
right.
Like you're on board, I'm on board, let's do it. It's like, I think that's also, important, is having that open dialogue.
Yeah. And if we can avoid it, I'm all for it. But looking at that cost on the front end, the other thing to consider there is it may cost you way more on the back end if you don't do it right.
Yeah.
And have to do it 3 or 4 times, right?
Yeah.
Like, unfortunately, like we said, there's a lot of recurrence of these issues, and if you don't do it right, you probably will have recurrence. So, that's thinking of the investment as like a more of a insurance policy. Right.
That's a good question, though. And I do think, like, again,
for
back to like why we're so big on the prereqs. It's going to save you a lot of money.
For sure. Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. So cool. Well, thank you for coming on. I appreciate you coming on and taking the time, and thank you everyone for the questions. I will tag you and I'll repost. So anyone that came in late, if you guys want to rewatch it, you can. And I'll do make you a collaborator, right?
Yes.
You could do that now, right?
Please,
so
that'll give me more content for the week.
Yeah, so put it on your page. So there you go.
Perfect.
Easy enough.
Okay.
Cool.
I'll talk to you later.
All right. Have a good rest of your day.
You too.
Bye-bye.